I had gone to the occupied territories in August 1988, so I began work here right after the Intifada began, and I think there was probably as much agitation here as there was in the West Bank and Gaza on account of my presence. I think I was the headline of the school paper about every other week that I was here. There was a very active Hillel. I called it the Hillel House. After a while, I started to call it the Heil Hillel House, or the HHH, and refer to them as the Jewish Citizens Council, for those of you who know the history. I can't say the memories are all that pleasant. A number of students that remain friends with them, one of them, Abdullah Hassan, he went to do journalism in Egypt, and now as we speak he's at Oxford. And there was also a young woman named Miriam who became a school teacher, and several, Richard Wright, Patrick Damas, they became lawyers. Camille Goodison, she's a professor now of literature in Brooklyn, and those are warm memories. I can say the memories of the faculty are very warm. Actually, it was one of my first introductions to politics, and it's one, always as I speak, I recall the story when the department decided it was time to dispose of me. I was in the political science department, which was supposedly a radical department, and they wanted the most radical professor in the radical department and said, "Are you going to support Finkelstein?" And the professor said, "I think Finkelstein would be happier somewhere else." And I thought to myself, isn't that a decision I should make? But things have changed. The campus looks different, parts of it. The beautiful building they built behind the field, the track field, that's new. The library is quite nice, for sure. It's beautiful. The thing that's most changed is you people. There were no Muslims at Brooklyn College in 1988. None at all. None at all. There are only a very tiny handful of Latinos. You can count in the number of your fingers. Brooklyn College was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It was 1/3, you call it ethnic white, Irish and Italian white. They used to hang out at the building in the quad, in front of the building. 1/3 Jewish, mostly yeshiva Jewish. Nothing more need be said. And 1/3 African American and Caribbean American. And so this is a new constituency at Brooklyn College. And I'm told they also have now a large Latino population at Brooklyn College. So some things have changed. The biggest thing that's changed is the level of hysteria. When I spoke here, I spoke several times. The audience, it was sheer bedlam, complete bedlam, and people were literally shouting me down, impossible to speak. Brooklyn College was very politically correct. I bet you the same people are still here, and Nancy Romer, Bob Cherry, they were all very politically correct, but on this issue, it was not to be believed. As some of you know, Brooklyn College's three most famous alumni are Meyer Kahane, Baruch Goldstein, and Alan Dershowitz, which says quite a lot for Brooklyn College. But it seems now to be a much more sane, calm, reasonable place. And That's something we should think about, or we should take to heart. Times have changed, and people are becoming, I hope, more reasonable. I'm going to speak this evening on what happened in Gaza between December 27th and January 18th, what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction. One of the peculiarities about speaking on this topic is it's usually the case that wars, death, and devastation, they come and go with quite great frequency and rapidity when it comes to the Middle East. But now we're fully a year and a half past what happened in Gaza, and yet the ghost of Gaza keeps haunting us. Israel can't evade the shadow of Gaza. And really, almost no day passes without another news item bearing on Gaza. So today, if you opened up your newspapers, you would read that the author of a report highly critical of Israel, Richard Goldstone, he's now in the midst of a battle in South Africa. He's a South African jurist, because the South African Zionist Federation and the chief rabbi are creating pressures so Mr. Goldstone can't attend his grandson's bar mitzvah. But we're a year and a half after Gaza, but still, Gaza lives. And one of the questions we want to ask ourselves this evening is, why won't Gaza go away? What happened during those 22 days of death and destruction, such that, try as Israel does, Gaza won't disappear? It's always arbitrary where you begin the background to any conflict. I'll start with January 2006. There were parliamentary elections in Gaza and the West Bank, and Hamas, the Islamic movement, they won the elections. Jimmy Carter, the former US president, who was one of the observers at the elections, he said they were completely honest and fair. Unusual in the Arab world. The immediate reaction of Israel, backed by the United States, to these completely honest and fair elections was to impose economic sanctions on the people of Gaza. In June 2007, Israel, the United States, and some Palestinian elements, they tried a coup to overthrow the legally elected government of Gaza. In the United States, that's called democracy promotion. Hamas wasn't too keen on this democratic initiative, and so they sent the Palestinian elements packing, and they took control of Gaza. Now, Israel tightened the blockade of Gaza. Amnesty International called the blockade, and now I'm quoting it, a flagrant violation of international law. The former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza during these months, and she said, Gaza's civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. Its whole civilization has been destroyed. In June 2008, Hamas entered into a ceasefire with Israel. It was brokered by the Egyptians. Each side had obligations. On the Palestinian side, they were supposed to stop their rocket and mortar attacks on Israel. On the Israeli side, They were supposed to lift the blockade of Gaza. The blockade which was a flagrant violation of international law. The blockade which was destroying a civilization. According to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. That's their words. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. But Israel refused or reneged on its obligation to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza, the blockade which was destroying a civilization. What happened next? It's not hard to find. All you have to do is go to Amnesty International's yearbook for 2008. If you open it up, turn to the section on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, you'll read this. A ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. It held for 4.5 months. But it broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on 4 November. The ceasefire was in place, and then Israel patiently waited till November 4th, the date of the historic election in the United States, where the media and the public, their attention was riveted to the result. And on that day, Israel invaded Gaza, killed 6 Palestinian militants, knowing full well that if they did, and when they did, the blockade, I should say, the ceasefire would break down, which it did. But then Hamas was very stubborn, because you know those Islamicists, they're sort of crazy. And Hamas kept saying, we want to renew the ceasefire. We want to renew the ceasefire if Israel agrees to lift the blockade, its original obligation under the terms of the ceasefire. Israel said no. Hamas had to unconditionally and unilaterally cease its rocket and mortar attacks on Israel. By December 2008, Sarah Roy, the Harvard economist and world's leading authority on the economy of Gaza, as well as on a personal note, the daughter of survivors of Auschwitz concentration camp, Sarah Roy wrote, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us in Gaza, but there is little international response beyond UN warnings, which are ignored." Now Hamas, the Palestinians in Gaza, they had 2 stark options. One, to acquiesce in their starvation. And as Sarah Roy said, there was no international response. Or to resist. Hamas chose, although largely symbolic, resistance. The former Israeli commander in Gaza, he said at this time, speaking to Israelis, he said, "You cannot just land blows, leave the Palestinians in Gaza in economic distress, and expect that Hamas will just sit around and do nothing." During the invasion, the Hamas leader Khalid Mashal, he said, "Our modest homemade rockets are our cry of protest to the world." What were those rocket attacks, if not a plea to an indifferent world? A message, SOS, we're dying. SOS, we're dying. It's easy enough to condemn the Hamas rocket attacks, and all human rights organizations have done so. But it seems you also, those who do condemn them, have to also show what other option do the Palestinians have. If you don't show another option, you're in effect saying that the Palestinians of Gaza had a legal moral obligation to just lie still and die. In any event, on December 27, 2008, Israel attacked Gaza. Nowadays, when people refer to those days, they typically refer to it as the war in Gaza. There was a war in Gaza. That's how it's being recorded for history, the Gaza war. And Israel says too, there was a war in Gaza. And Israel says it's because we fought. We were confronted by an asymmetrical war with Hamas terrorists. And granted, there was a lot of death and destruction, but it really wasn't our fault, because that's what happens in wars. There's confusion in the battlefield. People have to make split-second decisions, and so on and so forth. They say there are the fog of war conditions, and in the fog of war, errors are made, innocents get killed. But was there a war in Gaza? Was there a war in Gaza? After those 22 days, the Israelis were very proud of themselves. They went around saying, now we have shown the Arabs who's who and what's what. Now we've erased the defeat of 2006 in Lebanon. In 2006, July, August, Israel invaded Lebanon and suffered a major military setback at the hands of the party of God, the Hezbollah. Israel was very upset because it said now the Arabs aren't afraid of us anymore. It's what they call their deterrence capacity. Deterrence capacity is just one of those fancy phrases pseudo-scholars invent to make themselves sound important. All it means is the Arab world's fear of Israel. And the Israelis were very upset that now the Arabs weren't fearing Israel anymore. This fellow Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, he was going around taunting the Israelis, saying, go ahead, attack us again, and we'll defeat you again. We're not afraid of you. The Arabs aren't afraid of you anymore. Israel was very upset, but after Gaza, they said, now we've shown the Arabs that we're a fighting force again. We've restored our deterrence capacity. Well, but then an Israeli strategic analyst, he came along and he said, it is very dangerous for Israel to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during the 22 days. A former Israeli foreign ministry official said, there was no war. Hamas sat in its bunkers and came out when it was all over. So what did happen in Gaza? Well, we have a pretty clear military picture of what happened. During the first week, Israel launched its air assault on Gaza. And by the end of the 22 days, it had flown 3,000 combat missions over Gaza. Every plane returned intact. None was shot down. None was even harmed, which is not altogether surprising because the Palestinians in Gaza had no anti-aircraft defenses to speak of. It took as much courage to fly a combat mission over Gaza as for those of you who go to Coney Island on the boardwalk, as it takes to fire a weapon at the shoot the Freak Gallery and the boardwalk. After the first week, Israel launched its air and land assault. Well, Israel was equipped with special night fighting technology. Hamas couldn't even see them. So what happened in Gaza? Actually, we have a pretty clear picture, and from what you might call an unimpeachable source. The Israeli soldiers who were in Gaza afterwards delivered themselves of testimonies, what they experienced in Gaza. So here's what they had to say. Soldier, there was nothing there. Ghost towns, except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were really not too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there, that whole week. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course, not a soul. Soldier, go ahead. Ask the other soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing. No one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entry, but there just wasn't. There were no battles in Gaza. There was no fighting in Gaza. There was no foe to tangle with in Gaza. But that's only half the story. That's half the story. For the other half, it's very easy. As I was coming in here into this beautiful new edifice, I noticed there are many computer outlets, which is very nice to see. I wish people would also read books, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. So all you have to do is go to one of those computer terminals. It's very simple. And enter the words, breaking the silence. And if you enter those words as one word, up will come a collection of testimonies from Israeli soldiers. And after you have that on the screen, all you have to do is enter the word insane. And if you enter the word insane once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, insane, insane, insane. One soldier after another, even though they were interviewed separately, the word that kept leaping to each soldier's mind was, Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. No battles, no enemy, no one to tangle with, but Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. One soldier said, this was firepower such as I had never known. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking. Another soldier said, on the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd long gotten used to, but blasts that actually rocked the outpost, to the extent that some of us were ordered out of the house we were quartered in for fear it would collapse. Israeli soldiers commandeered Palestinian homes, and they were firing into the distance. But although they were firing into the horizon, they were using insane amounts of firepower, and the ground underneath them was shaking. And they were told to leave the houses for fear the houses would collapse on them. So what happened in Gaza? Actually, the Israeli soldiers came up with the most instructive metaphors. One soldier said, "It felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game." Another soldier said, "You felt like a child playing around with a magnifying glass burning up ants." You felt like a child with a magnifying glass burning up ants. Well, I was a kid. I wasn't born far from here. I was born in Borough Park, for those of you who know the area. And it wasn't the same as it is now. It's changed. It was a working class, very heterogeneous community. And I remember, I see it in my mind's eye, although we're talking about 50 years ago. I remember taking the magnifying glass, focusing the rays of the sun, and burning up the anthills, turning them to crispy critters. I'm not proud of it, but I don't recall at that point suffering from the delusion of believing I was engaged in a war with the ants. In fact, the metaphor is remarkably precise. One of the tools of the Israeli trade is the white phosphorus in all of its wars. I remember it from back in '82, the Lebanon War. It always drops the white phosphorus, and also the flechettes, if you go back to the '82 invasion of Lebanon. But I had never paid much attention to the details of what white phosphorus was. This time I did attend to the details, and it's quite extraordinary. White phosphorus reaches a temperature of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 816 degrees Celsius. As Oprah would put it, try wrapping your mind around that. 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. What did Israel do with the white phosphorus? Human Rights Watch, the respected human rights organization, put out a report entitled Rain of Fire about what Israel did in Gaza. And here's what they said. Israel repeatedly exploded white phosphorus munitions in the air over populated areas, killing and injuring civilians and damaging civilian structures. The white phosphorus on a school, Beit Lahia school. It dropped white phosphorus on the market. It dropped white phosphorus in a humanitarian aid warehouse. It dropped white phosphorus on 2 hospitals. It dropped white phosphorus in Al-Quds Hospital. It dropped white phosphorus in Al-Wafa Hospital. According to Human Rights Watch, the hospitals, and now I'm quoting it, were clearly marked, and there does not appear to have been fighting in that immediate area. So what happened in Gaza? By the end of those 22 days, 1,400 Palestinians were dead. About 4/5 were civilians. 350 were children. On the other side, 13 Israelis were killed, of whom 10 were combatants, and half the combatants were killed by other Israelis by accident, what's called friendly fire. So, for every 100 Palestinians killed, 1 Israeli was killed, a ratio of 100 to 1. For every 400 Palestinian civilians killed, 1 Israeli civilian was killed, a ratio of 400 to 1. That's not a war. That's a bloodbath. That's a slaughter. That's a massacre. But it's plainly not a war. Every time any of you, any of us, refers to what happened in Gaza as a war, every time we refer to the Gaza war, wittingly or unwittingly, we've become instruments of Israeli propaganda. The main Israeli defense for what happened in Gaza was, of course, that Palestinians, Hamas was using Palestinians as human shields, those cowardly Muslim, fanatic, whatever. How many people are familiar with the claim that Israel said it had no choice but to kill civilians because Hamas was purposely hiding behind civilians? How many are familiar with that? Raise your hand up high. Yeah, you have to be suffering from a major brain deficit or having excessively consumed mind-altering drugs not to be familiar with the claim. And in fact, all the human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Goldstone report, they all investigated the claim. And here's what they concluded. I'll quote to you from the most respected human rights organization, Amnesty International, the Nobel laureate for peace. Amnesty said, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. Even if it were true that Hamas used Palestinians as human shields, it still couldn't explain the death in Gaza. Why? Well, let's see what Amnesty had to say. The attacks that caused the greatest number of fatalities and injuries, the people were not caught in the crossfire of battles between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces, nor were the victims shielding militants or other legitimate targets. How did they die? Amnesty says, many were killed when their homes were bombed while they slept. Others were going about their daily activities in their homes, sitting in their yard, hanging the laundry on the roof, when they were targeted in airstrikes or tank shelling. How did the children die? How those 350 children in Gaza die? Amnesty says, and I'm quoting it, children were studying or playing in their bedrooms or on the roof, or outside their homes when they were struck by missiles or tank shells. Incidentally, there's a very simple way to confirm or not whether what the human rights organizations said is true. Because a lot of the weaponry Israel used in Gaza were drone-launched missiles. And the drone-launched missiles contained cameras. Actually, it contained double sets of cameras. The drone itself contained a camera, and the missile contained a camera. The missile was built such that literally, up until the last second of impact, it could be diverted away from the target. Now, Human Rights Watch, in one of its reports, it said Israel did things like targeted 3 children on a roof with a drone missile. Human Rights Watch said there was no military activity on the roof or in the area. If Israel wants to disprove the allegation, it's very simple. Release the video. One of the demands that Human Rights Watch just put out in its latest report. You say we're not telling the truth? Let's see the video. Why don't you release it? And we can tell whether or not it's true that the drone-launched missile went straight for the 3 children on the roof. Up until the last second, it could have been diverted, and you killed them. Or the drone-launched missile on the first day, which targeted several kids sitting several college-age people, including two women, standing at a bus stop. Amnesty said, Human Rights Watch said, there was no military activity in the area. Why did you kill them on that first day of the attack? Easy enough to check. Let's see the video, if Human Rights Watch is lying. Of course, it's not true that there was no human shielding in Gaza. There was a lot of human shielding in Gaza, and all the human rights organizations extensively documented it. It was the human shielding by Israeli soldiers of Palestinian civilians. All the investigative bodies, and there were a large number, to which I'll get to in a moment, they all reached the same general conclusion. They said that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity. And they all said that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but on an incomparably smaller scale, which is obvious. How many crimes can ants commit against a child, incinerating them with a magnifying glass? After the Gaza massacre, there were a large number of human rights reports that came out. By now, you could say there are at least a dozen, and probably close to 20, substantial reports. The best known one was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council. The council appointed a fact-finding mission, and the mission was headed by an eminent South African jurist named Richard Goldstone. Goldstone had formerly been the prosecutor of the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And within a few months' time, the Goldstone mission produced a very substantial report. It ran to about 500 pages, the Goldstone report. Its main conclusions were, number one, and I'm quoting it, that Israel launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. A deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. And its second main conclusion was, what happened in Gaza was not the result of some bad apples, some soldiers gone berserk, a few soldiers venting their sadistic impulses. No, the Goldstone report concludes, the systematic and deliberate nature of the activities we witnessed in Gaza leave the mission in no doubt that responsibility lies in the first place with those who designed, planned, ordered, and oversaw the operations. What happened in Gaza was the result of premeditated decisions, premeditated planning at the highest levels of Israeli society. Some people thought this was a harsh conclusion, but the problem was, what was the Goldstone mission to conclude in light of what Israeli leaders themselves were saying before, during, and after the massacre? Before the attack, the head of Israel's Northern Command, a fellow named Gad Eisenkot, he said, and now I'm quoting him, "We will yield disproportionate power against every village from which shots are fired on Israel. We will cause immense damage and destruction." The former chief of Israel's National Security Council, he said, "The next war will lead to intense suffering among the enemy population, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people." During the invasion, Israel's Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, she said, and now I'm quoting her, Hamas now understands that when you fire on Israel's citizens, it responds by going wild. And that is a good thing. Going wild. And that is a good thing. The day after the attack, Ms. Livni went on Channel 10 News in Israel, and she said, quote, Israel demonstrated real hooliganism during the course of the recent operation, which is what I demanded. Israel demonstrated real hooliganism, which is what I demanded. And then something peculiar happened. A few months later, Ms. Livni, she journeyed to the UK, and some citizens presented her with papers accusing her of being a war criminal. And Ms. Livni, she was shocked. She was bewildered. She couldn't understand what happened. She apparently believed that real hooliganism was protected by the Geneva Convention. A former Israeli defense official, he said, and now I'm quoting him after the attack, with an armada of fighter planes attacking Gaza, Israel decided to play the role of a mad dog for the sake of future deterrence. A former senior Israeli security official boasted, he says, Israel has regained its deterrence capacity. How? It has shown Hamas, Iran, and the region that it can be as lunatic as any of them. Lunatic, mad dog, real hooliganism, wild, intense suffering. What else was the Goldstone report to conclude except that Israel used disproportionate force designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, and that the decision and the planning came from the uppermost reaches of Israeli society? Well, there was as most of you know, there was a nearly hysterical reaction among Israelis and their supporters to the Goldstone report across the Israeli political spectrum. We'll leave aside the right wing and just look at what are called in the United States the doves in Israeli society. So first we have that Nobel laureate for peace, about whom Jody spoke so eloquently, Shimon Peres. He said that the report was a mockery of history. Peres said, Goldstone, he's a small man, devoid of any sense of justice. And then Mr. Peres proceeded to set the historical record straight for those of us suffering from illusions and misapprehensions. So, some of you, anyone here from the West Bank? Okay, so he set the record straight there. He said it's Israeli military operations that have brought economic prosperity to the West Bank. Anyone here from Lebanon? You? Okay, so he set the record on Lebanon. He said what happened in 2006 is that Israel liberated Lebanon from the wrath of Hezbollah. It also liberated 1,200 Lebanese from earthly existence, but we'll leave that aside. Anyone here from Gaza? Well, in case you were wondering what happened in Gaza between December 27th and January 18th, he said it was Israeli operations that enabled Gaza residents to return to their daily routine. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Perez. Actually, it's Sir Perez. He was knighted by the British. And then there's the Israeli ambassador to the United States, this fellow named Michael Oren. Some people even think he's a historian. And Mr. Oren said that the Goldstone report was even worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers, which, as you can imagine, is pretty terrible. Back in the United States, Brooklyn College's most famous alumnus, Alan Dershowitz. He said that the Goldstone report is so filled with lies, distortions, and blood libels that it could have been drafted by Hamas extremists. He said it recalled the protocols of the elders of Zion, and Goldstone was an evil man, an absolute traitor. As some of you know from having read Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, every circus needs a clown. So along came Elie Wiesel, and he said that the Goldstone report was a crime against the Jewish people. The obvious question about the Goldstone report and the reaction it evoked is why the hysteria? The Goldstone report was the last in a long series of human rights reports on what happened in Gaza. Amnesty International produced 2 very large reports. Human Rights Watch has now produced, at this point, 6 reports on what happened in Gaza. Palestinian human rights organizations, Israeli human rights organizations, independent fact-finding committees produced reports. And they all reached roughly the same conclusions. You could say the Goldstone report was the most cautious, the most conservative, the most judicious of all of them. So why the hysteria? The answer is really not so hard to find. Mr. Goldstone is not only Jewish, but he is, by his own reckoning, he says, I am a Zionist. He says, I have worked for Israel all of my adult life. I fully support Israel's right to exist. I am a firm believer in the absolute right of the Jewish people to have their home there. Mr. Goldstone sits in the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has an honorary degree from the Hebrew University. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter did Aliyah, Zionist immigration to Israel. When he was asked why he became a human rights activist and lawyer and jurist, he said, because of the Nazi Holocaust. That was the seminal inspiration for me. And now, as you could see, Israel has a real problem on its hands, because for decades Israel had honed these weapons, these ideological weapons, to discredit the acts of Israel, to divert attention from its record and from its conduct. So, if you criticized Israel, you must be an anti-Semite, or a self-hating Jew, or a Holocaust denier. But Mr. Goldstone's persona and his professional life, they neutralized those weapons. In fact, they rendered those weapons inoperative. As the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, referring to Mr. Goldstone, he said, this time the messenger is propaganda-proof. Mr. Goldstone, he doesn't look like or seem like your typical anti-Semite. He doesn't seem or look like your typical self-hating Jew. He says, I'm a Zionist. I love Israel. He doesn't look like or seem like your typical Holocaust denier. He says, it's the Holocaust that convinced me to go into international law. So if he wasn't an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, or Holocaust denier, if he wasn't incompetent or a fool, and the former chief prosecutor for the tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda is obviously not incompetent or a fool, if he's not an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, a Holocaust denier, if he's not incompetent or a fool, then there's only one possible explanation for what he wrote in that report. And the only possible explanation is, it's true. And that's why Israel went into panic mode. For our purposes, there are several important conclusions to draw from what happened in Gaza and from the aftermath of the Goldstone report. The main conclusion, which is of particular relevance here at Brooklyn College, and which perhaps accounts for the much more calm reception that we've received this evening, is that Goldstone is he's a classical Jew. He's liberal, a defender of human rights, a defender of the rule of law. He's in many ways the paradigmatic or the emblematic classical Jew. And for Jews who are overwhelmingly liberal, in the case of the United States, 80% of American Jews vote for Barack Obama. Among Latinos, it was 67%. If you factor in income, Jews being by far and away the wealthiest ethnic group in the United States, Jews should have voted overwhelmingly Republican, certainly much more so than Latinos. But they didn't, because Jews are liberal. The only ethnic group that voted more for Barack Obama than Jews were African Americans. And among whites in general, the percentage was about 43%. Nearly twice as many Jews as whites in general voted for Barack Obama. Jews are liberal. And it's become impossible any longer to say or claim you're liberal and defend Israel's human rights record, because they are irreconcilable at this point. What does it mean to be liberal? In the American context, it means support of international institutions, support of the rule of law, support of human rights. Amnesty International, it's a liberal organization. Human Rights Watch, it's a liberal organization. But it was exactly those organizations which were delivering the harshest judgments on what Israel did in Gaza. And so it's no longer possible to be liberal and supporting Israel, and therefore there is what you might call a gradual breakup of American Jewish support for Israel, especially among the younger generation, the 35 and under generation, if you look at the polls and the statistics and so forth. And now that leaves us with one last question, and then I'll have a chance to hear from you, along with Jody and Kareem, namely, what is to be done? So what should we do? And here I think it's useful to take some advice from somebody who struggled against another occupation, namely Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi pioneered, by his reckoning, he was the originator of the movement of nonviolent resistance, what he called Satyagraha. Satyagraha, anyone know what it means? It means hold on to the truth. Hold on to the truth. Originally, Gandhi was said to practice what was called passive resistance. And Gandhi was very indignant at that description of what he did that came from Henry Thoreau. He said, no, I'm not involved with passive resistance. He said, nonviolent resistance is the most active resistance there is in the world. So he wanted a term which captured the activeness of what he was involved in. And it was, I think, his cousin or his uncle who coined the term Satyagraha. Hold on to the truth. And I think that's a good image. I like the image of clinging almost desperately to the truth. That's our challenge, to hold on to the truth that what Israel has done to the Palestinians is wrong. And it's indefensible. To hold on to the truth that a diplomatic settlement of the conflict is within reach. But it's Israel, backed by the United States, that's blocking that diplomatic settlement. If we learn how to wield the weapon of truth as it's been embodied in the human rights community, recorded in the findings of the human rights community, if we learn how to wield the weapon of justice as it's reported in the uncontroversial principles of international law. The uncontroversial principles of international law. The Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal under international law. East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. Israel has no right to any of the West Bank, Gaza, or East Jerusalem under international law. The Palestinian refugees have the right to return or compensation under international law. Those are not only the principles of international law, those are the uncontroversial principles of international law. If we learn how to wield the weapons of truth and justice and show a little fortitude, a little backbone, then a settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict is within reach. I want to just say a couple of last sentences. Nobody here is talking about a vengeful outcome of the conflict. It's not about revenge. It's not even about vindication. It's about trying to achieve a just settlement according to basic principles of international law, which enable everyone, and I do mean everyone, to live proud, peaceful, and productive lives. That's what it's about. Jody quoted at the end of his remarks Edward Said, and by coincidence, I find myself quoting him as well. At the end of his life, Professor Said liked to quote the Caribbean poet M.A. Cesar. He liked to quote the line, "There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory." There's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. Just be reasonable. Show a little human decency. Respect the right of everyone to personal dignity. If you accept, if you're willing to support those elementary principles of justice, then there's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. And I, for one, hope I'll live to see the day, not only the day of me being there, but the being there with everybody who supports those basic principles. Thank you.